Hey, everyone. I'm posting here because I just need to vent, get this off my chest, and maybe figure out what to do next. I've been married to Eleanor for 6 years. On the surface, everything seemed fine, at least that's what I thought. I've worked construction since I left the military, and I've always enjoyed the straightforwardness of it. Build something, fix something, none of that gray area nonsense. Eleanor's been working in marketing for a while now, and she's been talking about her boss, Trevor, more than I'm comfortable with. At first, I thought I was overthinking it. Chalking it up to being overly cautious because of my past, Marine sniper then CIA. Those instincts don't really go away, even if it's been years since I hung up my boots. It started small. She'd casually mention Trevor during dinner, say he was a great leader or that he really knows how to motivate the team. Then she'd bring him up more often. His car, his big promotion, how he understood her struggles at work. I tried to convince myself it was harmless. People talk about their co-workers, right? But something felt off. I'll admit, Eleanor's been distant lately. She used to light up when I walked in the room, but now she seems distracted. She's been dressing a little sharper, staying later at the office, and her phone's practically glued to her hand. When I asked her about it, she laughed and said, "You're being paranoid." The paranoia, though, it wouldn't let go. I tried to push it down, but when you've spent years training to notice the smallest things, it's hard to ignore your gut. And my gut was screaming. So, I did something I'm not exactly proud of. I set up a little surveillance. Nothing too invasive, just a small camera in the living room and a voice recorder in the car. I needed to know if I was losing my mind or if something was actually happening. It didn't take long. 3 days after setting up the equipment, I heard Eleanor on the phone. She was laughing, a kind of flirty laugh I hadn't heard from her in a while. And then she said his name. Trevor. I didn't hear the whole conversation, just bits and pieces, but it was enough to make my stomach churn. She called him amazing and said he really knows how to make her feel appreciated. That night I couldn't sleep. I stared at the ceiling, thinking about how everything I thought I knew about my life could be a lie. Was I overreacting? Was this just innocent? Or was it the beginning of the end? The next morning, I couldn't look at Eleanor the same way. She was sitting at the kitchen table, scrolling through her phone, humming to herself like nothing had changed. Meanwhile, my head was spinning. I wanted to confront her right then and there, but something held me back. I needed more proof. The day passed in a blur. I went to work, kept my head down and tried to focus, but my mind kept drifting back to that phone call. What did she mean by amazing? Was I just insecure or was there something more to this? That evening I reviewed the footage. I didn't want to, but I had to. As I watched, I saw her sitting on the couch talking on her phone. Her face lit up in a way I hadn't seen in a long time. And then she said something that made my blood run cold. He doesn't suspect a thing. Honestly, it's kind of exciting. My heart sank. Who was she talking about? Me. Trevor. Both of us? Over the next few days I kept my cool but barely. I paid closer attention to Eleanor. Her habits, her tone when she spoke to me, the way she guarded her phone like it was a nuclear launch code. I even started noticing little things I'd overlooked before, like how she'd suddenly become obsessed with staying late at work, or how she'd go out for drinks with the girls, but come home smelling like expensive cologne that wasn't mine. Then came the tipping point. It was a Friday night and Eleanor said she was going to a work dinner. She got all dressed up, red dress, heels, makeup done to perfection. I asked her if she wanted me to drop her off, and she laughed saying, "No Tom, it's just a boring work thing." But I wasn't stupid. After she left, I grabbed my keys and followed her. She drove to a fancy restaurant downtown, one we'd been to once for our anniversary. I parked across the street and waited. Sure enough, a few minutes later, Trevor walked in. He wasn't hard to spot. Slicked back hair, tailored suit, the kind of guy who looked like he walked out of a cologne ad. They sat together at a corner table, leaning in close, talking, laughing. It wasn't just business. Anyone with eyes could see that. She reached across the table and touched his hand. That was all the confirmation I needed. I drove home, gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles turned white. I wanted to scream, punch something, do anything to get the rage out. But instead I sat in the car staring at the house, thinking about how everything I'd built, our marriage, our life together, could be crumbling beneath me. When Eleanor came home that night, I pretended to be asleep. She slipped into bed, kissed my cheek and whispered, "I love you." The words felt like a dagger to the chest. The next morning I woke up before Eleanor. She was still asleep, curled up on her side, looking peaceful. It almost made me second-guess everything I'd seen the night before. Almost. I decided to check her phone while I had the chance. I hated myself for doing it, but I needed answers. Her phone was on the nightstand and she never used a password. She always said she didn't need one because we trust each other. That irony wasn't lost on me. What I found confirmed everything I feared. There were messages from Trevor, long threads of texts, photos, even a video of them together at the restaurant. She called him babe. He told her she was the only one who gets him. There were plans for future work trips and promises to finally be together. But then I saw something that sent my heart racing. A message from Trevor, sent just the night before. "Has he noticed anything? We need to move quickly. Can't wait to be rid of him." Her response was equally chilling. "Don't worry. I've got it handled. He has no idea. It'll just look like an accident." I couldn't believe what I was reading. Was I being paranoid, or were they actually planning to harm me? The casual way they talked about it, like it was just another part of their day, made my blood boil. I put her phone back and went to the bathroom, locking the door behind me. I splashed water on my face, trying to calm down, but my reflection in the mirror told the truth. I was furious, hurt, betrayed, and now terrified. If this was true, if they were planning something, I couldn't let her know I was onto them. I needed to stay calm, stay ahead of them. I couldn't just leave. That might trigger whatever plan they had in motion. I had to be smart. That day, I started preparing. While Eleanor was at work, I went out and bought a burner phone. I contacted an old buddy from my CIA days, someone I knew I could trust, and told him I needed some equipment, cameras, recorders, the works. He didn't ask questions, just told me to give him a location and time. By the time Eleanor came home that evening, everything looked normal. I made dinner, we talked about her work dinner as if I hadn't seen her with Trevor, and I even joked with her about taking a weekend trip together. She smiled and said, "That sounds nice," like nothing was wrong. But inside I was already planning my next move. Over the next few days I focused on gathering evidence. I couldn't confront Eleanor or Trevor without proof, and I definitely couldn't go to the authorities without something solid. I needed to know exactly what they were planning and when. I installed a hidden camera in the living room and another in her car. I placed a recording device under the table where she always sat to make phone calls. Every evening, I went through the footage and recordings, piecing together their plans like a puzzle. What I uncovered made my stomach churn. Trevor wasn't just her lover, he was the mastermind. He was the one who came up with the plan to get rid of me. They were planning to stage a robbery. Trevor had connections to some guys who would break into our house while I was home alone, making it look like a random act of violence. Eleanor's role was to ensure I was there at the right time. "I'll make sure he stays home," I heard her say on one of the recordings. "He's predictable. It'll be easy." I could hear Trevor laughing on the other end of the line. "Just think about it, babe. Once it's done, we'll have his life insurance. No more sneaking around. No more guilt." "And Eleanor?" She laughed too. "I can't wait to finally be free of him." That broke me. Free of me? After everything I'd done for her? I thought about the life we'd built together, the years of sacrifices I'd made to give her a comfortable life. And for what? So she could plan to have me killed like I was disposable? But instead of letting the anger consume me, I focused on the task at hand. If they wanted to play dirty, they had no idea who they were messing with. I reached out to the same buddy who helped me with the equipment. I couldn't give him all the details, but I told him enough. Someone close to me was plotting against me and I needed a contingency plan. He hooked me up with a few things, nothing crazy, just tools to protect myself if things went south. Meanwhile, I played the perfect husband. I cooked dinners, joked with Eleanor, even kissed her goodnight like nothing had changed. It was harder than I thought it would be, but I knew I had to stay under the radar. Then one night I overheard a phone call that confirmed everything. Trevor, are we good for Friday? Eleanor, yes. He'll be home. I'll make sure of it. Trevor, good. Once it's done, meet me at the cabin. The cabin. That was my opportunity. I didn't sleep that night. My mind raced with everything I had to do. I wasn't just going to stop them, I was going to turn the tables and show them exactly who they were dealing with. Friday came faster than I expected. Eleanor seemed almost cheerful that morning, humming to herself as she poured coffee. She even kissed me on the cheek and said, "Don't work too hard today." I had to fight the urge to recoil. I played along, acting like it was just another normal day. But inside I was ready. That afternoon, Eleanor called me while I was at work. "Hey babe," she said, her voice sickly sweet. I was thinking, why don't you take the evening off? Relax at home. I'll grab dinner on my way back, okay? Sounds good, I said, keeping my tone steady. It was all falling into place. She was making sure I'd be home, right where they wanted me. I left work early and headed to a storage unit I'd rented under a fake name. It wasn't much, just a small space where I kept a few essentials. A bag with spare clothes, cash, a burner phone, and a Glock I hadn't touched since my CIA days. I hoped I wouldn't need it, but I wasn't taking any chances. Back home I set up everything I needed. I moved some of my surveillance equipment into the house, positioning cameras to capture every angle of the living room and front door. I even rigged the audio recorder to pick up every word spoken inside. By the time evening rolled around, I was ready. I sat on the couch pretending to watch TV, waiting for whatever Trevor and his guys had planned. At exactly 8:15 p.m., I heard the sound of breaking glass in the kitchen. My heart pounded, but I stayed calm, grabbing my phone and hitting record on the live feed. 3 men entered, all wearing masks and carrying weapons. One of them shouted, "Don't move." I raised my hands, playing the role of the terrified victim. "What do you want?" "Take whatever you want." The leader, tall, broad shoulders, stepped forward. "We're not here for your stuff, old man." He raised a gun and pointed it directly at me. But before he could do anything, I made my move. What they didn't know was that I'd rigged a flashbang near the doorway, triggered by a remote in my pocket. I hit the button and the room exploded in light and sound. The men screamed, disoriented, as I dove behind the couch. By the time they regained their senses, I had the Glock in hand. "Drop your weapons," I shouted, my voice steady. 2 of them froze, clearly panicking. The leader hesitated, but eventually he dropped his gun. I forced them to sit down, zip-tying their hands with the restraints I'd prepared earlier. They were still dazed and muttering curses, but I didn't care. I had bigger fish to fry. With the men subdued, I grabbed my phone and dialed Trevor's number from Eleanor's contact list. It rang twice before he picked up. "Is it done?" Trevor asked, his voice casual. "Oh, it's done," I said, my voice dripping with sarcasm. There was a pause. "Who is this?" "It's me, Tom," I said. "You know, the guy you were planning to have killed? Looks like your little plan didn't work out so well." The silence on the other end was deafening. What are you talking about?" Trevor stammered. "You'll find out soon enough," I said before hanging up. The look on the intruders' faces told me everything I needed to know. They hadn't signed up for this. They were just pawns in Trevor's game. Now it was time to confront Eleanor. With the intruders zip-tied and disarmed, I left them in the living room under the watchful eye of my recording equipment. They weren't going anywhere. I locked the front door, pocketed their weapons, and waited for Eleanor to come home. She walked through the door around 9:30 p.m., holding a takeout bag and humming a tune like she didn't have a care in the world. The sight of her made my blood boil, but I forced myself to stay calm. "Hey babe," she said cheerfully, setting the bag on the counter. "I got your favorite." I didn't respond. Instead, I stood there, arms crossed, staring at her. She must have noticed the tension because she turned to look at me, her smile faltering. "What's wrong?" she asked, feigning concern. "What's wrong?" I repeated, my voice low and steady. "Why don't you tell me, Eleanor?" Her face twitched just for a moment, but it was enough. She quickly recovered, plastering on a fake smile. I don't know what you're talking about. I stepped aside, revealing the three men tied up in the living room. Her face went pale. What's going on? She stammered. You tell me, I said, stepping closer. You sent these guys here to kill me, didn't you? Her eyes darted between me and the men. Tom, I don't know what you're talking about. I would never. Cut the act, Eleanor. I snapped, my voice rising for the first time. I know everything. The phone calls. The texts. The plan to make it look like a robbery. I have it all on tape. Her mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. You're mistaken, she said, her voice trembling. Trevor must have. Don't you dare try to pin this all on him, I interrupted. I heard you, Eleanor. You laughed. You said you couldn't wait to be rid of me. She froze, her hands trembling as she backed up against the counter. Tom, please. Let me explain. Oh, you'll explain, I said, pulling out my phone. I hit play on one of the recordings, the one where she talked about ensuring I'd be home. Her voice filled the room, clear as day. The color drained from her face. I didn't mean it, she whispered, tears welling up in her eyes. I laughed bitterly. Didn't mean it? You planned to have me killed, Eleanor. That's not something you accidentally say. She started crying, her voice breaking. I was scared, okay? Trevor said he'd ruin my life if I didn't go along with it. He said he'd hurt me if I told you. I stared at her, my jaw tight. Was this more lies, or was she finally telling the truth? I didn't know anymore. So what? You decided it was easier to kill me than to leave me. I said, my voice full of disgust. You had a choice, Eleanor. And you chose him. Her sobs grew louder, but I didn't care. I wasn't going to let her tears manipulate me. I trusted you, I said quietly, my voice shaking with anger. I gave you everything, and this is how you repay me. She slid down to the floor, her head in her hands. I'm sorry, she whispered. I didn't know what else to do. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. Well, now you're going to face the consequences. Eleanor sat on the floor, shaking and sobbing, but I wasn't moved. I'd seen plenty of people fake tears in my time with the CIA, and Eleanor's performance wasn't convincing me of anything. I grabbed a chair from the dining table and sat down, looming over her. Start talking, I said coldly. And don't leave anything out. Why, Eleanor? Why did you do it? She looked up at me, her mascara streaked down her face. I didn't want this to happen, Tom. Trevor, he made me feel special. Like I mattered. I didn't mean for it to go this far. That's not good enough, I snapped. What do you mean he made you feel special? What about the life we built? Was that nothing to you? It wasn't like that. She protested. At first it was just harmless. We talked at work, he complimented me. You were always so busy and I felt invisible. Invisible. I leaned forward, my voice dripping with sarcasm. I worked my ass off to give you everything, Eleanor. I cooked for you, planned trips, treated you like a queen. How is that invisible? She flinched, looking down at her hands. I know, but Trevor was different. He understood me. Understood you? I repeated, my voice rising. You mean the guy who convinced you to hire hitmen to kill your husband? That guy. She flinched again but didn't respond. I stood up, pacing the room. Let me guess, Eleanor. He promised you a new life, a fresh start. Told you it would be easy, right? And you bought it. You went along with it because it was convenient for you. Her sobs grew louder. I was scared, Tom. He said if I didn't help him, he'd tell you about us. He threatened me. Threatened you. I stopped pacing and looked at her, my anger boiling over. You had every chance to come to me. Every chance to stop this. But instead you laughed with him. You planned with him. And you're still trying to blame him. Her head dropped and for the first time she didn't say anything. Fine, I said, grabbing my phone. If you won't give me the truth, maybe Trevor will. I dialed his number, putting the phone on speaker. Eleanor's head snapped up, her eyes wide. Don't. She pleaded. Please, Tom, don't call him. But it was too late. The phone rang twice before Trevor picked up. "Hello," he said, his voice casual. "Trevor," I said, my tone icy. "It's Tom." There was a pause. "Tom. I wasn't expecting a call from you." "Oh, I bet you weren't," I said. "I've got your guys here, zip-tied in my living room. And Eleanor's sitting here crying, trying to convince me this was all your idea. So how about you tell me the truth?" The silence on the other end stretched for a long moment. Then, Trevor chuckled. "Well, I guess the cat's out of the bag." Eleanor gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "You're a real piece of work, Trevor," I said, my anger bubbling to the surface. "Did you honestly think you'd get away with this? Did you think I wouldn't find out?" "I'll admit I underestimated you," Trevor said smoothly. "But you have to understand, Tom, it's nothing personal. Just business." "Business?" I said, incredulous. "You tried to have me killed and you call it business?" "Come on," Trevor said. "You're not exactly a saint yourself, are you? Ex-CIA, ex-Marine, you've probably done worse." My grip on the phone tightened. "You don't know anything about me." "Oh, I know enough," he said. "Enough to know that you won't go to the cops. Guys like us handle things differently." He wasn't wrong. But I wasn't about to let him call the shots. "You're right, Trevor," I said, my voice deadly calm. "I don't need the cops. I'll handle this myself." I ended the call, my mind racing. Eleanor was staring at me, her face pale. What are you going to do?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't answer. I was already planning my next move. After I hung up the call with Trevor, the room was thick with tension. Eleanor sat frozen on the floor, tears streaming down her face, while the three tied-up intruders looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. I had to think carefully about my next move. I wasn't going to let Trevor win. He thought he could outsmart me, but he had no idea who he was dealing with. I turned to Eleanor. "You've got one chance to help yourself. Tell me everything, every detail about his plan, about his connections, about where he is right now. If you hold anything back, I'll know." She hesitated, her lips trembling. He told me he'd meet me at the cabin after everything was done. He said he'd take care of everything else." "The cabin," I repeated. "Where is it?" "It's about 2 hours north," she said. "He has a place near the lake. He said it's private, no neighbors, no one around to ask questions." "Figures," I muttered. A remote location was perfect for someone like Trevor. But that also worked in my favor. I grabbed a duffel bag I'd packed earlier. Inside were some tools from my CIA days, nothing too flashy, just the essentials: a comms jammer, night vision goggles, a tactical knife, and enough zip ties to immobilize a small army. "I'm giving you one last chance to come clean, Eleanor," I said, standing over her. "If I find out you're lying about anything, you'll regret it." "I'm not lying," she sobbed. "I swear, Tom, I didn't want this to happen." I ignored her pleas and turned to the tied-up intruders. "As for you three," I said, pointing at them, "your night's about to get a lot worse if you don't cooperate." "Who sent you?" The leader, the tall guy, glared at me but stayed silent. One of the others, though, cracked under the pressure. "It was Trevor," he blurted. "He paid us. Said it'd be easy, just scare you a little, rough you up, and make it look like an accident." "An accident," I repeated, shaking my head. "Well, congratulations. Your accident just blew up in your faces." The tall guy swore under his breath, clearly pissed at his partner for talking. I didn't care. I had what I needed. I grabbed my phone and called my CIA contact again. "I need one more favor," I said. "I'm sending you a location. Can you get me a backup team? Low profile." "Consider it done," my contact said. "What's the timeline?" "Tonight," I replied. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun had set, and the place was shrouded in darkness. It was just as Eleanor described, isolated with no sign of life for miles. The perfect spot for someone like Trevor to plot his schemes. I parked my truck a mile away and approached on foot, moving silently through the woods. The comms jammer was already active, cutting off any signal from the cabin. If Trevor was trying to make calls, he wouldn't be able to. Through my night vision goggles, I spotted movement inside. Trevor was pacing back and forth, talking to someone, probably on the phone, though he didn't realize the line was dead. I crept closer, keeping low and out of sight. My heart pounded, but my training kicked in, keeping me focused. This wasn't just about survival anymore. This was about justice. When I reached the cabin, I positioned myself by the back door. I took a deep breath, steadied my nerves, and prepared to strike. Trevor had no idea what was coming. The back door to the cabin wasn't locked. Amateur mistake. Trevor might have been good at manipulation, but when it came to operational security, he was sloppy. I slipped inside quietly, my Glock drawn, moving through the shadows like I was back on a covert op. The cabin was sparsely furnished, just a few pieces of rustic furniture and a roaring fireplace in the corner. Trevor was standing by the window, looking out into the darkness, clearly agitated. On the table beside him was an empty bottle of scotch, his phone, and a loaded pistol. I stayed low, positioning myself behind a large wooden beam. My adrenaline was pumping, but my movements were calm, precise. This wasn't my first time dealing with a high-stakes situation. I don't get it, Trevor muttered to himself, pacing the room. Why haven't they called? It should have been done by now. He poured himself another glass of scotch, downing it in one gulp. I waited for the perfect moment, then stepped into the light, my gun trained on him. Looking for someone, Trevor? He froze, the glass slipping from his hand and shattering on the floor. Tom. His voice was steady, but his eyes betrayed him, he was panicking. You didn't expect to see me, did you? I said, circling around him slowly. Trevor raised his hands, trying to play it cool. Now let's not do anything rash, Tom. We can talk about this. Talk. I let out a bitter laugh. You mean like you talked to Eleanor about having me killed? Or like you talked to those guys you sent to my house? His jaw tightened, but he didn't deny it. It's not what you think. Save it, I snapped. I've got all the proof I need. The recordings, the texts, everything. It's over, Trevor. But Trevor wasn't the type to back down easily. He glanced at the pistol on the table, and I saw the exact moment he decided to go for it. Don't even think about it, I warned, but he lunged for the gun anyway. Instinct took over. I fired a single shot, hitting the table just inches from his hand. The sound echoed through the cabin, and Trevor stumbled back, his hands raised in surrender. Okay. Okay. He shouted. You've made your point. I stepped closer, my gun still trained on him. Sit down, I ordered. He hesitated, but when I cocked the gun he quickly obeyed, dropping into the chair by the table. You know, I said, keeping my voice calm but firm, you really should have done your homework before you decided to mess with me. If you had, you'd know I'm not someone you can just scare off or take out. Trevor sneered, trying to regain some of his composure. What are you going to do, Tom? Kill me? You think that'll solve anything? I leaned in close, my eyes locked on his. I don't need to kill you, Trevor. You're going to destroy yourself. He blinked, confused. What are you talking about? I pulled out my phone and played a recording of one of his earlier phone calls with Eleanor. His own voice filled the room, incriminating him in every detail of his plan. I've got enough evidence to bury you, I said. And if you think Eleanor's going to cover for you, think again. She's already singing like a canary. Trevor's face paled. You're bluffing. I smirked. Am I? Because right now, a copy of this recording is sitting in a safe place. If anything happens to me, it goes straight to the police. So go ahead, Trevor. Make your move. He didn't. He just sat there, defeated, the weight of his failure finally sinking in. But I wasn't done yet. Now here's what's going to happen, I said. You're going to call Eleanor and you're going to tell her this is over. No more plans, no more contact. Then you're going to pack your bags and disappear. If I ever hear your name again, I'll make sure you spend the rest of your life behind bars. Got it? Trevor nodded, his bravado completely gone. Got it, he muttered. I handed him his phone. Start dialing. Trevor hesitated, staring at the phone in his hand like it weighed a ton. What do you want me to say? He asked, his voice shaky. Tell her it's over, I said firmly. No excuses. No manipulation. Just end it. With trembling fingers, he dialed Eleanor's number. I turned on the speaker so I could hear every word. It rang twice before she picked up. "Trevor," she said, her voice panicked. "What's happening? Did it work?" Trevor glanced at me, sweat beading on his forehead. "No," he said flatly. "It's over, Eleanor. We're done." "What? What do you mean?" she cried. "I mean, Tom knows everything," Trevor said. "It's over for both of us." The silence on the other end was deafening. Finally, Eleanor whispered, "You coward." Trevor hung up, dropping the phone onto the table. He slumped in the chair, defeated. "Good choice," I said, stepping back. "Now get out of my sight." Trevor didn't argue. He grabbed his things and stumbled out of the cabin, his shoulders slumped in defeat. I followed him to the door, making sure he got into his car and drove off. As the sound of his engine faded into the night, I turned my attention back to the cabin. I knew this wasn't the end, not yet. I needed to make sure Trevor and Eleanor's betrayal wouldn't come back to haunt me. I gathered the evidence I had, recordings, messages, and the confession I'd just forced out of Trevor. I secured everything in a safe place just in case. Back at the house, Eleanor was waiting for me. The moment I walked in, she rushed to me, tears streaming down her face. "Tom, please," she begged. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen. I was scared." "Save it," I said coldly, brushing past her. "I don't want to hear your excuses." She grabbed my arm, desperate. "What are you going to do?" I pulled away, my voice steady. "What I should have done a long time ago. This is over, Eleanor. You and I, we're done." Her sobs followed me as I walked upstairs, leaving her alone with her guilt. Eleanor followed me up the stairs, her voice trembling as she pleaded. "Tom, you don't understand. It wasn't supposed to go this far. Trevor manipulated me." I turned to face her, my jaw clenched. "Don't even try to spin this. You didn't just make a mistake, Eleanor. You planned to have me killed. You were laughing about it." She froze at my words, her tears falling freely now. I didn't know what else to do. Trevor said if I didn't help him, he'd ruin me. He said he'd expose everything. "Expose what?" I asked, narrowing my eyes. "That you were cheating on me? That you were willing to throw away our entire life together for some scumbag boss who sweet-talked you?" She shook her head, trembling. "It wasn't like that. I felt trapped, Tom. I didn't think you'd ever forgive me if you found out about Trevor, So you decided to kill me instead." I cut her off, my voice rising. "That was your solution? To get rid of me?" Her knees buckled, and she collapsed onto the floor. "I was scared," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I didn't know what to do." I took a deep breath, trying to keep my anger from boiling over. "You had a choice, Eleanor. You could have come clean. You could have walked away. But you didn't. You chose to betray me in the worst possible way." She looked up at me, her face streaked with tears. "I'll do anything, Tom. Anything to make this right." I stared at her for a long moment, my emotions a storm inside me. There was a time when I would have done anything for this woman. But now I didn't even recognize her. "You can't fix this," I said finally, my voice cold. "What you did, it's unforgivable." Her sobs grew louder, but I didn't care. I walked past her, heading back downstairs to grab my things. I wasn't going to spend another night under the same roof as her. As I packed a bag, I heard her footsteps behind me. "Tom, please," she said, her voice desperate. "Don't leave like this. We can talk." "There's nothing to talk about," I said, cutting her off. "You made your choice, Eleanor. Now, I'm making mine." She reached for me, but I stepped away. "I'll be filing for divorce first thing tomorrow," I said. "And trust me, I've got everything I need to make sure you don't get a dime. You and Trevor wanted to take everything from me. Now you'll have nothing." Her face crumpled and she sank to the floor again, crying into her hands. I didn't look back as I walked out the door. It was nearly midnight when I arrived at a motel on the edge of town. I checked in under a fake name, old habits die hard, and locked the door behind me. For the first time that night, I allowed myself to exhale. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at my phone. I had enough evidence to ensure that neither Eleanor nor Trevor could touch me again. But what was I supposed to do now? My marriage was over. The life I thought I'd built was gone. My phone buzzed, pulling me out of my thoughts. It was a message from my CIA contact. Checked into your situation. Trevor's got some skeletons in his closet. If you want to press charges, let me know, I'll make sure it sticks. I stared at the message for a long time. Pressing charges meant going public, dragging everything out into the open. It wasn't just about me anymore, it would ruin Eleanor too. As much as I hated her, I wasn't sure if I wanted to go down that road. After a long pause, I typed back, hold off for now. I'll let you know. I put the phone down and leaned back against the headboard, closing my eyes. My mind was racing, but one thought kept repeating over and over. I was finally free. Free of the lies. Free of the betrayal. Free of her. But at what cost? The next morning, sunlight streamed through the motel window, but it didn't bring any relief. I barely slept, my mind circling the same questions. What happens now? How do I rebuild from here? I stared at my phone for a while before finally calling my CIA contact. I want everything on Trevor, I said. Within hours, he sent me a file. Trevor wasn't just an entitled boss with a knack for manipulation, he had a history. Fraud, tax evasion, shady dealings with questionable people. He'd covered his tracks well enough to stay out of jail, but the skeletons in his closet were piling up. I smirked. Trevor thought he could manipulate me, but he didn't realize I had tools he couldn't even fathom. I spent the rest of the day setting things in motion. I compiled the recordings, texts, and emails, along with Trevor's shady financial records, into a single file. Then I sent it anonymously to his company's board of directors, the IRS, and a couple of investigative journalists I trusted to dig into the details. Trevor wouldn't just lose his job, he'd lose everything. By the time I finished, it was late afternoon. My phone buzzed with a call from Eleanor. I stared at the screen for a moment before letting it go to voicemail. When I finally listened to the message, her voice was raw, desperate. Tom, please just talk to me. I know I've ruined everything, but I can't lose you. Please call me back. I deleted the message without hesitation. There was nothing left to say. 2 days later, news broke about Trevor's downfall. His company released a statement about launching an internal investigation into financial misconduct, and one of the journalists I'd contacted published an exposé. The article laid out everything: his schemes, his manipulation, his toxic work environment. Eleanor didn't call me again, but I heard through mutual acquaintances that she'd quit her job. I wasn't surprised. She wouldn't survive the fallout from Trevor's mess. That night, I sat alone in my motel room, sipping a beer. The sense of closure I'd been chasing started to settle in. But it wasn't enough. I picked up my phone and dialed a number I hadn't used in years. When the familiar voice answered, I felt a pang of nostalgia. It's been a while, I said. Tom. The voice replied, surprised. Didn't think I'd hear from you again. What's going on? I'm thinking about coming back, I said. Got some loose ends I need to tie up. The voice on the other end paused, then chuckled. You sure about that? It's not exactly a quiet life. I glanced at the duffel bag on the floor, the tools of my old trade. Quiet's overrated. The call with my old CIA contact lingered in my mind as I drove through the backroads outside of town. It wasn't an easy decision, going back to the life I thought I'd left behind. But after everything that had happened, I couldn't shake the feeling that the simple life I'd built with Eleanor had been an illusion. The idea of returning to the agency felt like stepping back into reality, into a world I understood. There were no pretenses there, no fake smiles hiding daggers. It was dangerous, sure, but at least it was honest. For now, though, I had one more stop to make. I pulled into a quiet parking lot outside a small diner. Inside, my CIA contact was waiting for me. He'd always been the fixer, the guy you called when things got messy. And right now my life was a mess I couldn't clean up alone. He greeted me with a nod as I slid into the booth across from him. Didn't think you'd actually show up, he said. Neither did I admitted. We sat in silence for a moment before he pulled out a folder and slid it across the table. "You're not just here to catch up, are you?" I opened the folder and scanned its contents. It was everything he'd dug up on Trevor and Eleanor. Their financial ties, their communications, even details about their failed plan to have me killed. "It's all here," he said. "Enough to bury them both if that's what you want." I leaned back in the booth, letting out a deep breath. Trevor's already going down. I've made sure of that. As for Eleanor... He raised an eyebrow. "What about her?" I hesitated, the anger I'd carried for weeks bubbling back to the surface. She'd betrayed me in the worst possible way, but something in me couldn't bring myself to destroy her completely. "She's already lost everything," I said finally. "Her job, her reputation, her marriage. That's punishment enough." My contact studied me for a moment, then nodded. "Fair enough. But if you change your mind, let me know." I slid the folder back to him. "I appreciate it, but I'm done with her. I just want to move on." He leaned forward, lowering his voice. "And what about you, Tom? What's next?" I thought about it for a long moment, staring out the window at the quiet street outside. "I don't know," I admitted. "But I can't stay here. This town, this life, it's not for me anymore." A faint smile crossed his face. "Well, the agency's always got room for someone like you." I shook my head. "Not yet. I need some time to figure things out." He nodded, sliding out of the booth and tossing a few bills on the table. "Take all the time you need. But don't wait too long. Guys like us don't do well standing still." As he walked out, I sat there, staring at my reflection in the diner window. For the first time in weeks, the weight on my chest felt a little lighter. Maybe this wasn't the end after all. It was nearly sunset by the time I left the diner. The sky was painted in deep reds and golds, a quiet reminder that life moves on, whether or not we're ready for it. I drove aimlessly for a while, thinking about everything that had happened: Eleanor's betrayal, Trevor's scheme, and the mess I was leaving behind. There was no going back to the life I had before, but maybe that was for the best. Eventually, I pulled off the highway and parked at a small overlook. The view was stunning. A vast stretch of forest below, the distant sound of a river winding through the valley. For the first time in weeks, I felt a sense of peace. I grabbed my phone and opened my notes app, where I'd been keeping a list of things I needed to do. Divorce papers. Closing out shared accounts. Finding a new place to live. It was a long list, but it felt manageable now, like each step was part of reclaiming my life. And then there was the folder, the one my CIA contact had offered to leave with me. The evidence against Trevor was damning, but what surprised me was how much of Eleanor's involvement it revealed. She wasn't just following orders, she'd actively participated in the planning, even making suggestions. I stared at the road ahead, debating my next move. I could press charges, make sure she and Trevor paid for everything they'd done. But what would that accomplish? Revenge wouldn't change what had happened, and it wouldn't make me feel whole again. In the end, I made my decision. I deleted all the recordings and messages I'd collected, every bit of evidence I had. Not because they didn't deserve consequences, but because I didn't want to carry the weight of this betrayal any longer. Eleanor and Trevor would have to live with their choices, just as I would live with mine. The next morning, I packed up my things and left the motel, driving until the town was nothing but a memory in my rearview mirror. For the first time in years, I felt free. Not just from Eleanor, but from the life I'd been clinging to, the quiet, predictable existence I thought I wanted after leaving the CIA. As I drove, my phone buzzed. It was a text from my old contact. "Whenever you're ready." I smiled, tossing the phone onto the passenger seat. I wasn't sure if I'd take him up on the offer, but it felt good knowing I had options. The road stretched out before me, endless and full of possibilities. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't looking back. I was ready to start over.